Welcome to our Relationship with Animals and the Rise of Zoonotic Diseases panel. Thank you so much for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our platinum sponsors, the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights, Law and Policy, and Miyoko's Creamery. My name is Randall Abaid, and I'll be moderating this session. I'm a professor and endowed chair in Marine and Environmental Law and Policy at Monmouth University in New Jersey. I've been teaching and writing about animal law issues for the past decade and teaching and writing about environmental law issues for the past 3 decades. Just wanted to make a note to all of the students attending the conference. I'd be happy to speak with you in planning your career paths in either of these fields. This session will be pre-recorded presentations followed by a live Q&A. So I'd like to begin the session briefly with some remarks to set the stage for our discussion. Zoonotic disease is an infection, an animal infection that is transmissible to humans, and you'll be hearing a lot more about this from our panelists. And according to the CDC, approximately 75% of emerging infectious diseases are zoonotic in origin. And the long-standing and widespread destruction of animal habitats caused in part by climate change and other threats, the use of animals for human consumption, and the environmental and public health impacts from factory farming are all major drivers of pandemic risk. And certainly the COVID-19 pandemic has provided a valuable opportunity to assess our relationships with animals on a systemic level and pursue measures to limit the potential for future zoonotic disease pandemics. And so this is not something new, and I think that's very important that we're starting to understand in many circles in 2020 how severe and in some ways unexpected COVID-19 was. It really shouldn't be unexpected. As Arundhati Roy has said in characterizing the pandemic, it's the wreckage of a train that has been careening down the track for years. And to further quote Arundhati Roy, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This pandemic is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks, and dead ideas, and our dead rivers and our smoky skies behind us, or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. Building on the valuable insights that you're about to hear from the 3 outstanding speakers on this panel, I hope that you'll join us in the fight for that new world in which overcoming the threat of zoonotic diseases becomes one of humanity's greatest moral victories. Now I'd like to briefly introduce our panelists. First, Dr. Aisha Akhtar is a double board certified neurologist and preventive medicine specialist with a background in public health. She is the CEO of the Center for Contemporary Sciences, which is pioneering the transition to replace the use of animals in experimentation with effective human-based technologies. Dr. Akhtar is the author of a recent book, Our Symphony with Animals, on health, empathy, and our shared destinies. It's one that's on my reading list for later this year. Combining medicine, social sciences, and stories, her book explains how deeply the well-being of humans and animals are interconnected. She's also a fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. Our second speaker is Professor Erica Wyman, and she has more than 15 years of experience in international environmental law with an emphasis on wildlife issues. She's the director of the Global Law Alliance for Animals and the Environment, and this is an exciting new collaboration at Lewis and Clark between the Center for Animal Law Studies and the Environmental Law Program. As the director of the Global Law Alliance, Professor Lyman builds on her extensive experience in international wildlife law with a focus on CITES and several other international wildlife treaties that impact wildlife. Professor Lyman also teaches clinical courses at Lewis and Clark on international and animal law and international wildlife law to both JD and to animal LLM students. And finally, Professor Kathy Hessler, our third speaker, is a clinical professor of law at Lewis and Clark and a legend in the animal law field. She is the first and only faculty member to teach animal law full-time in a law school. A national and international leader in the field, Professor Hessler has co-authored Animal Law in a Nutshell, has written numerous other law review articles, and is co-authoring a new book on animal law. Professor Hessler has been teaching animal law courses since 2001 and has been an advisor to the Outstanding Animal Law Journal at Lewis and Clark since 1998. She is also director of the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative at Lewis and Clark. So we will begin our panel with a presentation from Dr. Akhtar.
So it was 1984, and my family and I were sitting around the dinner table discussing different topics. So here's my family then. These are my brothers and my sisters. And I'm the brooding, trouble-looking adolescent in the middle. Well, somehow the topic had come to this: should we eat animals? And we discussed it, and we decided that since humans have been eating animals since like forever, that eating animals was a right, and a healthy thing to do. The fact is, we didn't know anything about the topic, or even in general, our relationships about animals. We didn't know anything about the topic, and we didn't want to know anything about the topic. We were living in such ignorant bliss. So much bliss that we actually thought that this was a good look. Well, fortunately, I grew up and I became a little bit wiser to the larger world around me. But as a species, we are still very much stuck in our adolescence. We continue as though we are indestructible, and we continue as though we own this planet. And we have very little regard for all others with whom we share this planet. We are utterly self-absorbed as a species. And unfortunately, that mindset has led us to where we are today in the midst of a global pandemic. And this pandemic was actually very, very predictable. Many people did predict this pandemic, actually. And it's because we are seeing a rise in infectious diseases. Since 1980, we've been seeing new infectious diseases emerge at a rate of about 3 per year. But that number is likely going to be increasing over the next few years, and our risk for pandemics will likely increase over the next few years as well. And there's a number of reasons why our risk for pandemics are increasing. One is human population growth. There are now almost 8 billion humans on this planet, and with ever shrinking land available, we are increasingly living in congested, urbanized environments, conditions right for the easy transmission of infectious diseases. Two is our travel. We are now traveling the world at a rate that we never have before, and that is why COVID-19 was able to be spread around the globe so quickly. Three is climate change. With increasing temperatures, we increase our risk for what are called vector-borne diseases. These are infectious diseases that are carried by vectors, which are insects like ticks and mosquitoes. So warming temperatures facilitate the growth and maturation of mosquitoes, which make it easier for us to catch the viruses they carry, like the Zika virus. But out of all of those causes, the main cause, and I will say this again and again, the main cause for our rise in infectious diseases and pandemics come down to how we treat other animals. And if there is nothing else that you take from this presentation, I hope you at least go away with this: hurting animals hurts us. Hurting animals hurts us. It's incredibly simple, but it's utterly true. So let me explain how hurting animals hurts us. In 2014, the world watched in horror as Ebola virus, which is a deadly, deadly virus, raged across Western Africa. And thankfully, that epidemic is over now. But we suspect that the epidemic started through the bushmeat trade. And normally, humans get Ebola through the bushmeat trade. And this is where animals like non-human primates, wild boars, and fruit bats are caught, they're butchered and eaten for meat. Now, the bushmeat trade has existed for a long time, but it's been drastically ramped up in recent years. Now, with the logging industry clearing the land in Africa, and with more land being converted for agricultural use, especially animal agricultural use, we are facilitating the bushmeat trade. We are bringing humans and animals closer and closer in contact with each other. And that makes us more easily able to catch infectious diseases that these animals may carry. As we invade deeper and deeper into the forests and the jungles to catch animals for the trade, And as we take away their natural habitats, we bring wild animals and humans closer together. And that creates a situation which is much easier for us to encounter viruses which we never have seen before. That's how we got HIV. Before 1981, no one had ever heard of HIV, but we suspected the first person got infected through the bushmeat trade. But the bushmeat trade is just one tiny, tiny part of a much larger wildlife trade. And in the wildlife trade, millions of animals are either bred in captivity or captured from the wild and shipped around the globe. And they are sold for use as exotic pets, for entertainment, to stock zoos and circuses, as laboratory subjects for experiments, for meat, and for their fur and their skin. And just about every country is involved in the wildlife trade. And the US is actually one of the largest importers and paradoxically, one of the largest exporters of wildlife. And wildlife trade, this global wildlife trade is big, big business. So every animal involved in the wildlife trade suffers tremendously as they are passed from dealer to dealer, shipped overseas, or killed on site in profoundly painful ways. Imagine you're one of these animals, going about your business. Suddenly you are ripped from the only home you know, ripped from everything you know, ripped from your family. You're jam-packed with multiple other species or other animals into a flimsy crate. And you would be incredibly stressed and distressed. And that would mean that your immune system would go down. And it would make it much easier for you to catch an infectious disease. And this is what happens with other animals. The wildlife trade creates and brings together very sick animals from different species, ideal conditions for a pathogen to pass from one animal to another and then ultimately onto humans. And this is how we got SARS, the severe acute respiratory virus that emerged in 2003. Here's what happened. SARS emerged out of a wildlife market in China in 2003, and it is a coronavirus, just like COVID-19 is. And at the time, public health authorities had tracked down the SARS virus into these critters, these guys. These are civets, and they are traded for different reasons. They are bred and captured for the wildlife trade. And when the Chinese public health authorities found coronavirus in civets, their response was to kill thousands of these civets by poisoning them, by disinfecting them in bleach, and by electrocuting them. Well, years later, after this mass execution of civets, coronavirus was found not to originate from civets, but likely to originate from these guys. And these are fruit bats. And we believe that coronavirus and many other viruses are carried naturally by fruit bats. They carry them, but they don't get sick. And fruit bats were also caught up in the wildlife trade. And so what we believe happened is that at some point in the wildlife trade, the coronavirus passed from fruit bats onto civets and then onto humans at the wildlife markets in China. Situation that's almost identical to what we think happened with the emergence of COVID-19. The wildlife trade causes immense, immense suffering of animals. And because of the wildlife trade and because of many other factors, we are seeing these new infectious diseases rise at an ever increasing rate. In fact, 3/4 of emerging infectious diseases come from other animals. But of course, it's not their fault. They are victims of a very brutal business that makes it so easy for a new virus to pass from one animal to another and then ultimately onto humans. And because of the wildlife trade, no human anywhere is safe from these viruses. Every human life is now impacted by the way we treat other animals. And nowhere is this more apparent than in our eating habits. So we talked about 8 billion people now on this planet. And for every human on this planet, there are about 10 land animals raised and killed for food at any given time. 10 animals per human. Now that is a massive, massive industry. And we know by now that the majority about 95% of the meat, eggs, and dairy that are sold throughout the world come from factory farms. And when we're talking about factory farms, we're talking about immense suffering, again, in animals. And so factory farms have conditions that are so similar to what's occurring in the wildlife trade. We will have animals jam-packed by the hundreds, the thousands, sometimes the thousands into a single building. And I just a few years ago, I actually toured some of these factory farms in Oklahoma. And I have to tell you, pictures or even videos don't even come close to conveying what these places are like. The moment you enter one of these farms, all your senses are affronted, and your body just immediately reacts and tells you there's something so drastically wrong with this place. Factory farms are horrible places, and they cause immense suffering in animals. And by causing animals to suffer, we cause ourselves to suffer. When you eat meat, eggs, and dairy, you're eating something that is teeming with bacteria like E. coli and Salmonella. And the very drugs we rely on to combat these bacteria are being fed into these animals constantly. At some point in the 1970s, it was discovered that by feeding animals in factory farms low and continuous doses of antibiotics, which are now defined as growth promoters, the industry was able to keep these animals surviving long enough to make a profit. And that's how they depend on antibiotics to keep these animals surviving in such miserable conditions. And so what that does is that creates superbugs on the farm, bacteria that our antibiotics can no longer fight. Multiple recent studies have found bacteria, harmful bacteria, in about 2/3 of our beef and pork products, and in almost 100% of the chicken sold in our grocery stores. And what's more is almost all of that bacteria was found to be resistant to at least one or more antibiotics. Now, most of these bacteria, actually all of them that we're talking about here, E. coli and Salmonella, for example, are intestinal bacteria. They live in the intestines, the guts of humans and other animals. So when your meat or your egg or your dairy product is contaminated with E. coli, Campylobacter, or Salmonella, basically your meat product is also contaminated with feces. Now, as bad as the bacterial infections are in factory farms, that's not actually our greatest risk. Our greatest risk doesn't lie in the bacteria, but in the viruses that emerge from these factory farms. And when we're talking about viruses coming from factory farms, what we're really talking about is the influenza A virus. Now, when most people think about influenza virus, they're thinking about the seasonal viruses, the seasonal flus that we might get vaccines for. And it doesn't seem like a big deal. But that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about the influenza A viruses. Unlike other types of influenza viruses, influenza A viruses can be carried by a wide range of species. And for that reason, it makes it very difficult, almost impossible to track and contain. And influenza A viruses are the ones that will likely have a chance of becoming a pandemic. Now, all influenza A viruses originate from wild aquatic birds, so like wild geese and wild ducks. But humans rarely become sick from direct contact with these animals. Something has to happen to the virus to allow it to become deadly to us. And this is where factory farms come in. Despite all attempts otherwise, studies have shown that an influenza A virus can easily enter a chicken factory farm. And once it does, it can quickly transform from what's called a low pathogenic virus, meaning a very mild virus, into a highly pathogenic virus, meaning a very deadly virus. What's more, pigs are virus mixing vessels. Pigs can carry influenza viruses from other pigs, from chickens, and from humans. So if the situation is right, a new virus can emerge from pigs that can be easily spread among humans. Now, in factory farms, I talked about how these animals are crowded, sometimes by the hundreds of thousands, into one shed. Now, just think about that for a moment. Right now, with the coronavirus, our public health agencies are telling us, and rightly so, that we should be socially distancing ourselves. Keeping separate is the best way, one of the best ways to prevent the spread of the virus. So why are we doing the opposite when it comes to animals in factory farms? By crowding animals into the thousands and hundreds of thousands, we create conditions that allow a virus to spread from animal to animal like wildfire. You see, animals in factory farms are like nightclubs for viruses. In these animals, different viruses can get together, exchange greetings, and swap genetic material. And each time a virus passes into another animal, it can quickly transform and mutate into an even deadlier form. Now, despite how deadly our current coronavirus, COVID-19 is, it's not nearly as bad as it could get. The virus right now has a lethality of somewhere between 2 to 3%, meaning that 2 to 3% of people who contract coronavirus will die from it. But let's compare that to some other viruses that we've seen that have come out from the wildlife trade and from animal agriculture. We've seen the SARS virus, the SARS coronavirus that came out in 2003, that had a death rate of about 10%. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, emerged a few years ago in Saudi Arabia from the camel industry. That had the death rate of about 35%. Nipah virus that emerged near pig farms in Malaysia has a death rate of a near 55%. And avian influenza H5N1, this is a bird flu that emerged out of animal agriculture in the late 1990s, has a death rate of about 60%. So we're dealing with a virus that has a death rate of about 2 to 3%. Can you imagine what would happen if we were dealing with a virus that had a death rate of about 60%? And as long as we continue to treat animals in the way that we are, we will see more and more viruses emerge that have a potential that can cause a much, much worse problem than what we are facing today. And the problem with these viruses is that they are always out there. All of those viruses I mentioned are still out there. They are still mutating, and they mutate at a very rapid rate. In fact, we are always going to be 1,000 steps behind a virus. But there is one way out of this, a very important way out of this. And really, we have to do this if we want to save ourselves. And for us to get out of this and to get ahead of the equation and to prevent these viruses from emerging in the first place, we really, truly need to grow up quickly as a species and move from our adolescent stage and become adults. And that means ultimately that we have to change our mindset. And what that means is that we have to stop confusing animals as what, and we have to start knowing animals as who. And I know this sounds Pollyannish, but it's utterly, utterly true. If we want to save ourselves, we have to save animals too. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about such a timely topic, and I'm happy to be a part of this panel. I just want to recognize, before I start, everybody who's worked so hard to organize the conference in a way that's responsive and adjusted to our current situation. It seems like it's going really well. So this presentation that I want to do reflects some of the research and work we're doing at our clinic at Lewis and Clark, the International Animal and Environmental Law Clinic. Given our time constraints today, I want to focus this presentation on elaborating perhaps slightly some of the connections drawn by Dr. Akhtar and identifying at a very high level some possible avenues of intervention, along with basic mapping of when, where, and how regulatory intervention could reduce zoonotic disease risk and address animal health and well-being. So the first place to start is just to look at some basic facts and figures. The previous speaker provided a good overview here, so there's no real need for me to provide much detail. But there are two key points here that I want to emphasize. First, the 72% figure. According to a study in Nature that looked at global trends in emerging infectious diseases, 72% of recently emerged EIDs originated in wildlife. So for me, this demonstrates the urgent need to deal with the zoonotic disease risk posed by the global movement of wildlife for human consumption. If we're ever going to have, any opportunity to prevent future pandemic risk, we really need to focus on the risks posed by our wildlife consumption. The second fact here that I want to draw attention to is this last bullet point. There are ongoing epidemics that get very little media attention, but that affect many, many people, often in the global south. The risk of zoonotic disease is really disproportionately borne by people who live in natural resource-rich environments. And it's the levels of consumption in other parts of the world that drive these increased interactions that lead to zoonotic spillover, whether the drivers are direct or indirect drivers. So it's something I want us to all be aware of. We're sort of caught up in pandemic frenzy right now, but at least epidemics are occurring regularly and ongoing as we speak, in addition to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this slide here looks at the drivers of zoonotic disease risk and zoonotic disease spillover. And I think Dr. Akhtar did a good job describing some of these interrelationships. What I want to emphasize is the interconnectedness of zoonotic disease risk and this other looming crisis, the extinction crisis. We're losing species at an unprecedented rate, and the drivers of both species loss and our exposure to possible zoonotic diseases and thus future pandemics are really the same. We're looking at direct exploitation of wildlife and habitat loss and land conversion for agricultural production. So we have these twin drivers that are feeding into these two crises, and these are set against a backdrop of climate change, which impedes the resiliency of our natural world and compounds these impacts. Really, the big takeaway here is that our relationship with nature is dysfunctional at this point in time, and if we're going to address either of these crises, it's imperative that we do so boldly. So what does that look like? And what do we need to be aware of in order to do that? I think to sort of wrap our heads around the current situation and the interrelatedness of these crises and of our relationship with nature, Dr. Ghebreyesus, the Director General of the World Health Organization, actually, I think said it really quite well. So here's what he said: the pandemic is a reminder of the intimate and delicate relationship between people and planet. Any efforts to make our world safer are doomed to fail unless they address the critical interface between people and pathogens and the existential threat of climate change that's making our Earth less inhabitable. So what I think is important here is that he's recognizing these interfaces. And the interfaces that he speaks about are the moments in which we interfere with animals, either directly through direct exploitation or indirectly when we encroach into habitat for a variety of consumptive purposes, often with a commercial intent. It's clear that both habitat loss and land conversion, as well as climate change, are critical risk factors. What I'm focusing on in this presentation specifically are wildlife supply chains. Many calls to action have focused on live animal trade. And while this might pose the greatest risk for global pandemics, all sorts of supply chains exploit wildlife and lead to interference by humans. putting people at risk of zoonotic disease spillover. These include supply chains for food, pets, medicine, fashion, decor, cosmetics, research and medical testing, amongst others. And it's important that whether at some point during the sourcing and processing or during transit, shipment, and distribution, which can include global movements, or at the point of retail, or likely at all of these stages, animals suffer dense confinement, unnatural groupings across different species and taxa, and stress, all of which make them vulnerable to disease. In fact, just recently, there's an important study of exotic meat supply chains in Vietnam that shows that viral load carried by live animals in some of these supply chains amplifies as animals move from source to consumer. And then additionally, we know that overexploitation in and of itself in general is associated with a higher risk of pathogen spillover. Those who work sourcing wildlife stay out for longer periods, they move further and further into forested areas, interacting with a greater range of wildlife, and work opportunistically, right? They're more likely to work opportunistically. So the question is, how do we regulate wildlife supply chains to achieve better outcomes for both animals and humans? So what do we do about it? Really, that's the question, and that's sort of where I want to take a little bit more of an in-depth look at sort of zoonotic disease risk and wildlife trade. What I have here, I'm calling an intervention typology for a One Health approach, because we have to look at this issue through a lens of interconnectedness. It's important that we bring into the picture the so-called One Health approach, which even prior to this pandemic had gained traction in international discourse. This approach works toward optimal health for people, domestic animals, wildlife, plants, and our environment, right? So it's recognizing all of these interfaces. And the approach has been endorsed across many relevant sectors and both international and local fora. So at the international level, it's recognized and endorsed through the World Health Organization, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the World Organization for Animal Health, amongst others. The thing is that it requires operationalization. As it is, it's just a framework. So the question is, what does this operationalization look like? Or what could it look like? What should it look like given our current circumstances? So I think of this as having sort of two sides to the equation. On one side, we need to very clearly and directly eliminate as many risks as possible through regulatory intervention. On the other hand, where either due to political, socioeconomic, or other barriers, we need to promote interventions that reduce risks. When eliminating risks, we might think about harvest and use restrictions, where we're cutting off either or both supply and demand. And to me, to my mind, this is the keep wildlife in the wild approach. And here, when we talk about these types of regulatory interventions, I think it's really important to emphasize the importance of sharing the regulatory burden between both importing and exporting countries. So looking at the burden as distributed between source and demand countries in the case of global supply chains. We want to do this for both equity reasons and enforcement reasons. Too often, burdens shift exclusively to exporting and source countries, which drive inequities in the application of international compliance mechanisms, and frankly, ignore the role that market demands in importing countries plays in creating the vacuum that drives wildlife exploitation and illegal trade. So accountability for demand side drivers is essential. And as part of these efforts, it's really important that we recognize that just transitions of livelihoods are also critical, as are coupling market closures with education programs, alternative protein sources, and other necessary support. So then looking a little bit more in detail at what eliminating risks could look like, or where regulatory interventions to eliminate risks might occur. This slide is an illustrative look at these opportunities. On the international side of things, you see CITES, the Convention on International Trade and Endangered Species. This is most often discussed as a possible forum for international action. And in a lot of ways, this makes really good sense. CITES has a 50-year history of closing markets and regulating trade through a comprehensive regulatory framework and permit regime, right? Which is both commendable and appeals in the current circumstances. Under CITES, those species that are facing a risk of extinction that may be impacted by international trade are put on what we call Appendix 1, and all commercial trade is prohibited. This is clearly a powerful tool. The problem is, in our current circumstances, or given the current issues, as many folks are now discussing, the treaty is designed to address conservation risks, not health risks. Some have proposed to amend CITES to add an appendix that deals with species that pose a particular health risk. Our position here is that while the regulatory mechanism of CITES, including the restrictions on commercial use of certain wildlife, it can be useful and instructive and is important, the current extinction crisis reminds us that, really CITES already operates with an unfulfilled mandate and is underfunded relative to that mandate and what it's supposed to do. So from our perspective, piling onto that regime may not be the best approach. But we would, we do consider that something like the development of a protocol could be a way to sort of capture the functionality of CITES and at the same time create a distinct forum to address animal and human health risks. So you establish separate mechanisms to deal with a separate set of risks, borrowing what is important and useful from the CITES regime, but leaving CITES intact to do its job vis-a-vis the extinction crisis. Other international fora are also discussed as relevant in this endeavor. There's been discussion of promotion of a UNGA resolution, for example, on animal market closures. The adoption of a resolution wouldn't per se close animal markets, but what it can do is signal strongly to the international community to incorporate such reforms into domestic legislation. And this is the importance of signal setting. I've also put up here the Food and Agricultural Organization as an option. Interestingly, this body does have treaty-making authority, and at times it's been used to really good effect, such as in the case of the Port State Measures Agreement, which applies in the fisheries context. And I definitely believe that a closer examination of FAO opportunities is necessary in the context of addressing zoonotic disease risk. Now, I think what's important here is that we can't discuss risk elimination without really discussing the importance of domestic action, right? This is where any significant regulatory movement will occur. And I've highlighted a few examples of such action. So China, for example, has closed wildlife farming and restricted consumption of wildlife as food. Bolivia, as you can see here, has taken some action to address wildlife markets. Gabon has taken action to prohibit the consumption of bats and pangolins. Plus, they've taken the pretty extraordinary step of protecting their great ape populations from contracting COVID-19 from humans. So recognizing that the zoonotic disease risk really can work both ways. And just recently, a bill a bipartisan bill was introduced in the Senate along with a companion bill in the House to end US imports and exports of live mammals, birds, amphibians, and reptiles, plus closures of our own domestic animal markets. There's some caveats to those restrictions built into the bill, but really these are progressive steps, and we need both domestic action that is bold and then international agreements and signal setting to continue to build momentum at the domestic level. When trade and use restrictions are politically infeasible, the kind that we talked about in the last slide, we need to focus on risk management, which means that we are focusing on specifically animal welfare concerns, not just this idea that we're keeping wildlife in the wild. So with this in mind, we're really looking at each step in the supply chain as a possible point of regulatory intervention. The normative challenge here is that many of us are likely to agree, of course, that what's been done to date often fails to be sufficiently protective of animals, and frustratingly, the regulatory structure often devolves into industry-driven standards. In large part due to this inescapable fact and the fact that eliminating risk in the form of trade, harvest, and use restrictions is scientifically justified in the context of preventing future zoonotic spillover, primarily because we're working with a set of unknowns in the context of future risk, we have put energy into the other types of regulatory intervention, the keep wildlife in the wild approach. But it's worth noting here that now might really be a moment where some political will might exist to address supply chain and welfare concerns. So in the broader wildlife and international animal welfare community, we know organizations are active through OIE in terms of enhanced veterinary standards and reviews of wildlife trade. There's ongoing work to strengthen international standards such as the IATA guidelines, the International Air and Transport Alliance guidelines, amongst other things. One of the important factors here when looking at this type of regulatory intervention is enforcement, particularly when it comes to intervention that is going to allow commerce, but just regulate it in some way. In order for that to work at all, strong and comprehensive compliance and enforcement mechanisms must be in place. So we're talking about strictly supervised permit regimes coupled with enhanced oversight of supply chains by enforcement officers. Even in the US, where we have capacity beyond what many other countries have to regulate and exert some oversight over wildlife supply chains, really only a small fraction of wildlife shipments are ever inspected. And for these types of regulatory interventions to work, we need to enhance that. So finally, what I want to address here, and I'm going to do it in pretty short order, is the issue of economics. And because the reality is that when folks in my community, in some of your communities say trade bans or use restrictions, others say livelihoods. The issue of the loss of livelihoods and the cultural and economic consequences of wildlife market regulation is a really common typical rejoinder to any calls to sort of modulate direct human exploitation of wildlife. Without belaboring the details here, there's actually a really great article just recently published by Chris Walzer of Wildlife Conservation Society, where he responded to these arguments that we're confronted with in our workspace. And he really called out the rejoinder for what it is, a thinly veiled smokescreen. So as he writes in the article quite well, we need to be really honest in assessing the costs of taking action against the costs of the current pandemic, against the costs of past pandemics and future pandemics. And there's no math that I know of that can rewrite the equation in a way that would indicate that the costs to those currently partaking in the wildlife exploitation industry outweigh the cost of inaction. The figures on this slide are taken from a recent article published in Science magazine. According to these calculations, as you can see here, the global preventative costs over 10 years of preventing pandemics, so those regulatory interventions that we've talked about today, amount to only 2% of the cost of just the current pandemic alone. So never mind the cost of future pandemics if we continue on a business as usual trajectory. I want to end here, my time is up, by saying that, it's clear that the time is now for bold action to keep wildlife in the wild. With both the pandemic and the extinction crisis at hand, it's just really abundantly clear that we can't afford anything less. Thank you very much for the time.
Let me add my welcome and thanks for having me at this panel and in the conference. I'm going to talk a little bit about climate change in slightly different ways. I want to enlarge our conversation. So I'm going to add the political and social conversation to the environmental climate change conversation, and I'll focus on aquatic animals. So I first wanted to thank the planning committee. It's a fabulous event under these challenging circumstances, and thank the sponsors and to everyone who's attending and watching. I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. My presentation is coming to you from Portland, Oregon. And here at Lewis and Clark, we honor the Indigenous people whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand. And that includes the Multnomah, the Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin, Kalapuya, and many other Indigenous nations of the Columbia River. And we do this out of respect, but it's also really important to know that we can learn more about respectful relationships with animals and the planet from these historical and present-day communities. Given the pandemics, the wildfires, the hurricanes, flooding, drought, social unrest, these are examples of our urgent need to repair our relationships. So we have a lot to learn. I'm gonna, as I said, talk a little bit about political and social climate change, environmental climate change, a tiny bit, and then I'll focus on the impacts they have on fishing and aquaculture, and end with some positive thoughts. So political climate change. I live in Portland. This is a picture I took from downtown Portland. There's an awful lot going on, and it affects our work. So some of the political changes we need to be considering while we're doing the work we're trying to do, and think about the intersection, think about the impact it has. I'm just going to list some high-level overviews. We could talk about this for quite a long time, but I just want to raise some of these issues to the conscious level. So undermining the rule of law that's been happening, the role of courts, police, legislatures, and military are called into question right now in the United States and around the world increasingly. In the US, our government has deregulation as a goal. The Trump administration has reversed 100 environmental and animal regulations in his time in office and has tried to reverse far more. The government is undermining and attacking journalism, hollowing out agency expertise, and reducing staff, making it harder for them to do the jobs that they're hired to do, undermining public confidence in science, experts, and facts, changing the rules in the midst of decision-making, taking more direction from corporate interest and self-dealing to enrich themselves and their families. These are significant challenges while we're trying to work with the government to improve the lives of the animals, the people, and the planet. The political destabilization that we're facing is really extreme for the United States. We know that continuity and consistency are crucial in good governance, and that's not just internally, but for our international relationships as well, which are crucial when we're trying to do environmental and animal protection. We know that stable societies are good for people, except for those who profit from instability, right? Our institutions may be flawed, and there are critiques from the left and the right, but they are important and they become critical in times of crisis, and we are facing unprecedented crises. We know that animal and environmental protection don't work if you can turn those regulations and protections off and on based on political administrations. So this instability impacts our work in advocacy. We need to think about it as we're planning and strategizing our work. Environmental climate change, I won't speak much about it. My colleagues have already done some of that work. This is a picture from my house, from the wildfires here in Oregon. We're facing unprecedented environmental devastation across the country and the planet. So I don't need to go into that. Most people are pretty familiar with that, but I do want to highlight government's contribution to the environmental devastation through deregulation, through inaction, through removal of protections for animals and the planet, and reducing the role of the federal government as an agent of environmental protection. And this damage impacts our work in our advocacy as well. Again, these pictures from Oregon, from the wildfires and the relief effort that follows. Some of our energy needs to go into this effort instead of some of the other effort that we were already working on. So COVID-19 is a combination of social, political, and environmental sort of crisis right now. On the left, you see what the highways look like during shutdown in China and really across the globe. And many of us were hopeful that this would be a moment of environmental restoration, but it is short-lived, and we see new environmental problems that come from the pandemic. So this picture on the right is just new problems, right? This is PPE that we might not have been going through at the rates we're going through that needs to be incinerated now as biohazard. So we have increased challenges under COVID. We have educational, health, safety, economic challenges. There are additional challenges to the rule of law that have been brought on by the pandemic, increasingly for animal and environmental challenges. One example is that the US EPA temporarily restricted their enforcement. They said, we're just not going to enforce and make folks comply with some of the rules that are already in the books, which is understandable on one hand, a little crazy on the other hand. There's also been less revenue, regulation, and enforcement of the protection methods that we already have in place. There have been some temporary benefits, so less pollution in some cases, in some places, better breeding conditions for animals in the spring, which was a delight to see. But those have by and large been offset by new problems. So the increased use of single-use plastics for safety and for convenience has just skyrocketed, and it's going to create additional problems to the pollution that we already had to face. Another example is that the search for the vaccine could kill hundreds of thousands of shark to be used for the squalene, that oil, and that exacerbates problems that we already have with eradicating sharks from the oceans. So focusing on fishing and aquaculture. Starting, we always have to go back to square one, which is that animals are still legal property, right? And we know that that frames the conversation and it frames the content, right, in the space in which we can work. So there are efforts to change this classification. Those efforts are focusing on mammals rather than aquatic animals. And so this is me just raising the aquatic animals again into our memory. So the impact on those animals from fishing and aquaculture, we know that from the 2018, which is our most recent data from the FAO, that there are 96.4 million tons, those aren't animals, tons of animals in the wild caught fishing industry, also called capture. 82.1 million tons of aquatic animals through aquaculture are killed annually. And then there you'll see that there are other algae, seashells, pearls, and we're talking about 1 to 3 trillion finfish a year, and that's just finfish. That's not crustaceans, mollusks, other kinds of animals. And the rise in this industry is just phenomenal. So a 14% rise in capture fisheries from 1990 to 2018 is not a lot. 527% rise in aquaculture production. There's no other industry booming like this industry, and it's slated to continue in this way for quite a long time into the near and distant future, which is why we need to focus on regulation. Okay, so let's talk about some of these impacts. Environmental impacts, we know that wild caught fishing is continuing even in overfished areas. It's continuing for human food to support the aquaculture industry, and people are not sufficiently taking into account climate change and all sorts of other problems when setting fishing quotas. The climate change impacts are pushing species to the brink. We have so many problems that we could talk about for ages, but they're not being taken seriously enough. We have pollution, we have oil and gas production, we have wildfires, and we know that when we stress the ecosystem, it has less resiliency for the new crises that continue to come. And that's the situation we find ourselves in and are looking to be in for quite a while. We've talked about drought in the US more and more, and people have suggested that that's not strong enough word, that we have to talk about mega drought and aridification. It's a new way to think about the landscape. And this is a more permanent condition that we have to address. It's been said that the US Southwest has, for the last 2 decades, has had the second driest stretch in 1,200 years. That's pretty amazing when you're talking about the scope of change. And that if unchecked, in 50 years, the places where 3 billion people now live across the globe will be too hot for human habitation. We have strange and unusual changes that are taking place. We have bookies now betting on shark migration. And some people in the conservation industry seeing this as a potential fundraiser, which is potentially problematic, right? So thinking about the environmental impacts and how we evolve and address the new realities that we're seeing is something we have to continue to think about. We know that lobbyists are continuing to try to get the Trump administration to change regulations. And one of the new things they've been working on is to open the world's largest one of the world's largest marine protected areas in Hawaii to commercial fishing. He's already done that in the Atlantic marine protected area. Now people are pushing for the Hawaiian one as well, which would have devastating impacts on some very unique species. We know that we pit animals against each other. We have what were formerly endangered sea lions being killed to save endangered salmon. This is basically a flawed management policy, right? Pitting vulnerable species against each other, killing the animals rather than reducing sport fishing, commercial takes, not honoring treaty rights. We have closure of oyster fisheries. We have essential US fish habitats that are not being taken care of, not being managed as well as they should. I'm going to go more quickly through some of these things because this is really meant to be sort of an overview of the issues. So as we have reduced regulation and enforcement in this area from the COVID impacts, we have political impacts. So we have President Trump issuing a couple of executive orders to support the fishing and lobster industries, trying to remove regulation and sort of work his way around a court decision that was not helpful for him, and including opening up the marine sanctuary, which we don't think is legal. So on aquaculture in particular, we talked about the increase in interest in it. The situation in the United States is that NOAA had approved 2 sites for aquaculture. The Fifth Circuit said, no, you can't do that because you're supposed to regulate fishing under Magnuson-Stevens and not this. Aquaculture is not fishing. So that's one of the reasons the Trump administration has issued their executive order to try to avoid the outcome of this decision. We'll talk about that later if folks are interested. In all of the regulation right now for US aquaculture, welfare and humane treatment requirements are not included. There is the Aqua Act, which is to support aquaculture development, but it has not yet been passed. The 2020 Dietary Guidelines Committee urges increased seafood consumption. We have trade wars. We have some states who are beginning to restrict ocean aquaculture. So it's a very fluid area of developing law right now in the US. So there have been COVID-19 impacts as well here. They've gotten PPP loans. They're using PPE in increasing amounts and taking that away from other workers. The workers are in danger themselves. We know many people have been infected and some have even died from COVID. So there's increasing pollution from the aquaculture systems in the wild. So some of these affect wild animals and fisheries with the same kinds of things factory farming has as far as impacts for terrestrial animals. We also know there's lots of contamination in these animals, contamination of the people who live near these facilities, and it's increasing, not decreasing. We know that some hundreds of thousands of animals are culled or killed, emergency harvest it might be called, when there is a problem at a facility. We know that waste, the picture in the lower right-hand corner is salmon blood being pumped after having been purified, we're told, straight into the ocean. So we know that there's some significant environmental impacts with these facilities. This is happening across the globe. The US actually is not a leader in aquaculture. And so we see the problems of using animals within these systems, cleaner fish, to eat lice off of the farm salmon that they wouldn't be getting in these numbers if they weren't held in this kind of capacity confined situations. We know that the First Nations rights and interests have been ignored or downplayed across the globe. And we know that more funding, both private and government, is being funneled to development. This is just one new form of aquaculture. Just wanted you to have a sense of what it's looking like. This is the world's first offshore deep sea fish farm off the coast of Norway. And the plan is that this one facility would be able to raise 3 million salmon or 16,000 tons annually. So the scope of what we're talking about is really enormous. And so the impacts are really important to take into account. The fact that we're taking wild fish to feed farm fish is really problematic. And the fact that we're not protecting the wild environments we're taking those fish from or putting aquaculture pollution back into is really problematic. I won't go into this right now, but we can talk about it later. It's just useful to know what's happening. So we're talking about aquaculture being used to feed humans, to feed other fish, and for other purposes, including restoring populations of threatened and endangered species. So we have fish stocking, we have hatcheries, we have all kinds of different facilities. And we're talking about, again, billions and billions and billions of fish every year. But without welfare regulations, without lawsuits to protect them, without guidance from the agencies. So some positive impacts, right? Because we know that there's political and there's social and there's environmental crises, climate crises. And so we want you to be thinking about how challenging that environment is, but we also want you to think about some of the positive things. So human impact doesn't have to always be bad. So because we need to think about the good stuff, again, I won't mention all of these. The slides will be available, but I want to highlight a few things that we can be happy about. So during the pandemic, there were a record number of turtles hatched, so more elephants born than usual. We know that some of the destructive industries that have impact on the wild are being shut down, which is wonderful. We know that plant-based food sales are rising. We know that we've had some really successful lawsuits trying to protect these animals in these places. Some countries are trying to focus on our biodiversity loss, which we know is increasing exponentially year by year. There's legislation, not just in this country, but around the world, trying to help specific species of animals or habitats or larger ecosystems. We know that some of the efforts that people have made are actually working. The Whale Safe and the ECHO program to help quiet the oceans around whales, helping save their lives, which is a wonderful thing. The Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission is finally focusing on the relationship between predators and the rest of the ocean. So that basically we're not just taking these animals out of the ocean for our own need, we have to recognize the impact on the animals who would be eating them. And that's now being taken into account, which is great. So like I said, we could talk a lot about all of these things. I just want you to know that there are things to be happy about, right? Courts in India and Pakistan say animals have legal rights. That's phenomenal. Our Maui case, County of Maui case, is a really good one. So really briefly, I just want to say that the Aquatic Animal Law Initiative at Lewis and Clark has been created to try and focus on these issues with respect to aquatic animals. And so our goal is to acknowledge the problems they face, to adapt and address those issues, to develop resilience around those problems, focus on sustainability. We want to engage with others, build responses, and in doing so, clarify the weaknesses in the legal system that pertain to all animals, to the planet, and to people. And this is just a list of some of the things that we've been doing at the initiative. And I'll just call out really quickly World Aquatic Animal Day, which will be coming up again in the spring. But there's a lot of work that we've been doing to focus on the impacts of aquaculture, both within consumers, public health, land use, and certainly on wild environments. I will end there and look forward to your questions. Thank you for your interest in attending the conference, and I'll talk with you shortly.
And I'll read that one. It's to all panelists. How do you propose circumventing or facing the inherent anthropological difficulties that arise when trying to change the ways in which various cultures utilize animals in their everyday practices? What are practical ways we can stop factory farming, the wildlife trade, and hunting practices in cultures that may be resistant to these changes due to spiritual, religious, cultural, and other reasons. I did respond to the question regarding factory farming, but I want to turn it first to Kathy to see if she has other thoughts on this.
I do. Thank you. And thank you for the question. It's a good one. I think one of the ways in which we can both be respectful of people and their cultures is to learn what they are and to learn what is a traditional way for them to interact with animals, because I think sometimes we have a lot of misunderstandings about that. We have a lot of either rosy stereotypes or awfully negative stereotypes, neither of which necessarily may be true. One of the easiest answers to the question is if we allow people to determine for themselves their usage of animals, none of that includes factory farming, right? The intensive ways in which we experiment on animals these days aren't traditional, aren't culturally related, if you will. And so if we went to the communities and said what uses are appropriate in your mind, it would automatically be better than what we're doing right now. Beyond that, we can encourage conversations and dialogue with communities. The communities that I've had the pleasure and honor of speaking with are interested in sustainability. They're interested in connectivity. They're interested in health of the planet, of the animals, and of their people. And so engaging in those dialogues and finding the way together, rather than us thinking we have answers to these questions that we're going to impose on communities, even if we're trying to do that in a culturally sensitive way, is not going to work. We just have to engage in these dialogues, talk about what are the options, what are the pathways forward, and we have to be honest about the need for cultural sensitivity and respect. We have to be honest about the need for access to food and poverty elimination. And once we build those in as bases for our conversation, respectful dialogues with communities, I think we'll be able to move forward much, much more quickly.
Thank you for that very thoughtful response, Kathy. And Aisha, did you have anything to add to that question?
I think the main point I would highlight is the risks that are coming out for us. When we think about pandemics, infectious diseases, those aren't related really to the culturally, the small cultural practices that are kind of left over from the past in a sense, or that, for example, if I talk about the bushmeat trade, the bushmeat trade has existed for centuries. But that's not why we're now seeing an increased risk in infectious diseases from the bushmeat trade. We're seeing an increased risk because of Western influence, because we're going in with the logging industry and removing the forest and making it easier for close interactions between chimpanzees, other non-human primates, other animals that may carry Ebola, and the people who live there. So it's really not so much of these indigenous populations and their cultural practices that are the risk factors for pandemics. It's what Western countries, and started out with Western countries, but now we know that China is very much involved with factory farming, and many countries in South America as well. So it's really more of a global issue, but it's these large global industries, the wildlife trade, factory farming. These are the real risks, not the smaller cultural practices that I think the question is referring to.
Thank you very much. It's very helpful, Aisha. And I think following up on another question to you, it is in reference to emerging infectious diseases. Which do you think is more dangerous, human affluence or population growth?
I don't know how you could actually tease the two, but I'm glad you did bring up human population growth, because it is a huge elephant in the room, right? The huge human in the room, in a sense. There are too many of us, way too many of us. And because of us, we're also increasing the growth of domesticated animals. So for every human on this planet, there's about 10 land animals raised or killed for food at any one time. So it's human population, as well as all of our impacts that affect the planet and affect other animals that are just so very much entwined that are causing this huge risk in pandemics.
Other thoughts on that, Erica or Kathy?
Erica?
No, I don't have thoughts on that. No, Kathy, do you?
I would echo what Aisha has said and suggest it's part of the reason that we need to think sort of more intersectionally than we sometimes do and look for ways to engage others in conversation about things that we think are important, but hear what they think is important and look for a common ground where we can move forward together and solve some of these problems, because none of us will be able to solve them in silos. And unfortunately, it's taken us a little time to spend in those silos to learn the things we needed to learn, but we have to do a little more work to break out of those silos and learn additional things and reach across other disciplines to work with people to solve these problems.
If I can also just go back to one thing that Erica mentioned in her presentation is, working, maybe focusing less on what other countries are exporting, and in a sense, and you tell me if I'm misinterpreting what you said, Erica, but also we could have a greater impact by looking at what we are importing and exporting. I mean, really look at what we as a nation are doing. The United States, as far as wildlife trade, the United States is one of the major drivers of the wildlife trade. And so if we curtailed the demand for wildlife, for all of the different uses of wildlife, then we can have a significant impact on the global wildlife trade as a whole.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And by the US taking action, it has the substantive impact, as you say, and it also, sends a signal to the international community. It puts the US in a leadership position of both addressing the extinction crisis and zoonotic disease risk. And we have these two crises, and we need to deal with both.
Yeah.
I think we only have time for one more question. Were there any questions in the chat that any in the Q&A, the published Q&As, that any speaker had a burning desire to respond to? And some of them we responded to in writing. One that came in on the later side is, how do you think we could transform public health risk awareness into legal tools? Would an international global approach be more effective than a regional one?
We will need an international global approach ultimately, because there are no borders now when it comes to infectious diseases, and that has been very clear with COVID-19. So I don't know how. I'll leave it to my legal experts to come up with the brilliant ideas, but it cannot be a regional approach.
I would agree. And I would say, though, that we'll have some laboratories locally, in jurisdictions where people can try different things and see what works before they go global. I would also say we just need a broader view of what the problem is. People are thinking about the wild animal trade, and that's one of the things we've been focusing on. But if you think about simply how many people import, say, reptiles for pets in the United States and get sick, right, from handling those animals. So there are so many facets to this conversation, and we're talking about reconceptualizing animals as trade, as objects of trade, right? That would be a really useful starting point. And going back to what Aisha said, that we're connected. And so when animals are ill, we become ill. And so that's something that needs to be built into both the regulatory decision-making, so that we understand that for our own health, but also protecting animals for their own sake.
Eric, any comment on that?
No, I would just add that I think from a regulatory perspective, we're not going to achieve what we need to achieve in terms of risk reduction and outcomes unless we're looking at intervening at multiple levels, right? There are multiple international fora that are going to get us the signal setting opportunities that are going to set markers for where, what countries should move toward in terms of their laws and policy. There are a few opportunities for regulation, some where we're drawing down risk to the extent possible by eliminating certain supply chains, more where possibly we're regulating supply chains. And for me, this raises the really important role that domestic action plays, because, you know, international lawmaking can be very slow. And we need countries, and I think in particular importing countries, as we talked about earlier, to take the bold action to sort of drive, you know, up the legal hierarchy, these policies, and at the same time, you know, promote the policies at this international level so that at scale we're bringing up, you know, what we would consider to be best practices or international norms. So it has to be integrated.
Well, that's all the time we have. I hope all of the attendees enjoyed this set of presentations as much as I did. Thank you so much for joining us for this session.